Hey there, this is going to be the same intro for all of the upcoming weekly devotional videos. In January of 2022, we did a question and answer Sunday, and you guys submitted so many questions, there was no way that I could possibly answer them all in a Sunday service. So what we decided to do instead was answer as many as I could in that Sunday service and take the rest and make them weekly devotionals. So what you are about to see is a question submitted by members of the congregation for question and answer Sunday, but we're going to be answering these over an extended period of time. So I hope that you enjoy this weekly devotional. I hope that you are having a fantastic day. And if you have any questions about Conoy Brethren in Christ Church, if you want to get involved in some way, shape, or form, feel free to check out our website, conoychurch.org, or email me at nick@conoy.org. Have a great day.
Hey there, Conoy family. Today's devotional comes not from a question from our question and answer Sunday, but it comes more from a question that I have asked in the past, that I've wrestled with in the past. I'm not trying to create a straw man argument where I put something before you and then fix it or answer it. I want to put questions before you that I think are helpful to us as we engage in our everyday faith. And so a question that I have heard asked before, that I've heard from many different people over the years, but one that I've also wrestled through is it important for us to have community outside of the church? And I saved this question for this week because we just had Pastor Steve Mann come and talk to us about the importance of community and fellowship, and what a great job he did on Sunday. And so now I want to ask the question, not whether you need to have community, Christ-centered community as a Christian. I want to ask the question, is it important for us to have community outside the church? Because my experience with church, growing up in it anyway, has been that it has been harped on over and over and over about how important it is that you are really careful with who your friends are and your influences are, and that you make sure that you stay above reproach and that you don't, find yourself holding community with certain types of people, and there's all sorts of things like that. And I get it, as a parent, as a pastor, as a past youth worker, I've said all those things too. I get it. We want to be really cautious with the people that we mentor, that we disciple, because we don't want them to go down the wrong path. We care about them. We love them. We're invested in them, and so we want them to make good decisions so that they stay on a path that follows Jesus. The problem with that is that many Christians get stuck there. They get stuck in I have to be so careful that I don't associate myself with X, Y, and Z types people, that all I ever do then is associate myself with Christians and church people. And I don't think that is where we are meant to stay. I do understand the wisdom of telling our children that. I understand the wisdom of telling our young Christians that. But at some point, as they mature in their faith and their journey with Jesus and their relationship with Jesus, the truth has to be that they get beyond the church walls and into the lives of people who may not know who Jesus is. So let me read this passage to you. This comes from Matthew chapter 4, which, if you're familiar with the Gospel of Matthew, puts us right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So we have John the Baptist preparing the way, and Jesus is baptized, the Holy Spirit descends on Jesus. Then Jesus goes right into the wilderness, and he experiences the temptations or the trials given to him by Satan. He comes out of the wilderness and he begins to preach, and he finds the disciples, the first disciples, who are fishermen, and he calls them to follow him. And then this is the passage immediately after, and here's what it says. This is Matthew 4, starting in verse 23. It says, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across Jordan followed him. So, that's just 3 verses. I think the author of Matthew almost uses this as a transition statement, because we have these almost first-person accounts of the temptation, the baptism, Jesus preaching, calling the disciples, and then suddenly we're going to get into this massive sermon called the Sermon on the Mount that he gives, and we need some way to transition from these stories about Jesus to this sermon that Jesus does. And so we have these 3 transitionary verses that tell the story of Jesus traveling the countryside, kind of the known area at the time, preaching this message that he's been given, but also healing the sick and the demon-possessed, and finding these large crowds that seem to follow him wherever he goes. And the large crowd is what gathers before him when he gives the Sermon on the Mount. I want you to think for a moment, what would it be like if Jesus was the sort of rabbi who never left the synagogue? Just consider that for a moment. We have those sort of rabbis, right? I mean, that's kind of what the Pharisees were. The Pharisees were these religious leaders. They would have been trained like rabbis. They would have been those who had kind of studied and mastered the law of Moses. They would have been well-versed in all 647, or I forget the actual number, but I think it's 47. 613, I think it is. Laws that go with the law of Moses to keep yourself holy and clean. They would have taught at different places and times. They would have maintained a separation between themselves and the public, though, for as much as possible, to stay away from those who were not clean, right? So, If Jesus had been the sort of rabbi that never left the synagogue, he'd have looked a lot like a Pharisee. Now, what would Jesus' message have been like if he never left the synagogue and had looked more like a Pharisee? Rather than being a rabbi who wandered the countryside and healed people and preached the gospel and called disciples, made fishermen into fishers of men, what would his ministry have looked like? It wouldn't have looked like what it looks like today, I can guarantee that. In fact, we sort of had this religious ministry that didn't leave the temple, and that was the Pharisees. That's sort of what Jesus came to change. One way we could look at it is that Jesus came to do away with religion, and instead he gave us a relationship, right? He said, look, you don't need this intermediary between you and God. You have me. I am that for you, right? And so like when Jesus dies on the cross, we talked about this at Easter, the curtain in the temple that had separated the Holy of Holies from where the priest is, separating God from man, that ripped. It made these 2 separate places one place, right? Jesus calls himself the temple. So the place that is supposed to be set aside for God, Jesus says, that is me. I am the temple. When you come to me, you're coming to the temple. Jesus takes that place for us. So God sends Jesus to kind of do away with this religion and bring relationship. That's sort of my point, I guess, today. You and I can't have simply church community. Let me rephrase that. You can't simply have community with Christians. When you get to a place in your relationship with Jesus where you are maturing and you are no longer someone you're no longer in the sort of danger, that the immature danger of, well, this person wants me to do this thing or say this thing or act this way, so I'm going to do it because I want to fit in with this crowd, or whatever that might be, that peer pressure thing. When you are able to mature to a point where you're like, look, Jesus is the center of my life, and everything that I do and everything I say and all the ways that I act, they're going to be centered around him, and there's going to be times I make mistakes, and I'm going to ask for forgiveness for those things, but really Jesus is the thing for me. So if there's somebody out there that says, hey, I want you to do X, and X doesn't follow Jesus, I don't really have a problem saying no to that. And when you get to that point of maturity in your faith, it's kind of time for you to start doing what Jesus did. And Jesus didn't keep company with all the holy people. Jesus kept company with those who were way outside the box, way outside the margins, those who have been forgotten or pushed aside or cast aside, right? And there's a reason for that. If you go all the way back to Genesis, Genesis chapter 12. When God is creating his people group, essentially, right? He calls this man named Abram, and he wants to make Abram into a nation. And Abram becomes Abraham, and there's a whole story, right? And you should check out our series that we did a couple of years ago called The Faithful. It's a chapter-by-chapter sermon series on the story of Abraham. But regardless, God calls this guy named Abram, and here's what he says. He says, I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. If we really think about what God was doing when he initially created his people who started with Abram and moved to become the Israelites and moved to then become the Jews, then after Jesus, they include the Gentiles and the door is opened wide to everybody. God's people, right? You and me. Church people, Christians, those who follow Jesus. What God was doing when he created that group of people is saying, look, the point of all of this is that I want you to be a blessing to all peoples everywhere. No one out there is not to be blessed through you by me. So think about that, right? Think about the people that, depending on your upbringing or depending on your faith or depending on what you've been taught your whole life, who is it that's in the marginalized camps today? There's definitely been times when it's those who have a different color skin, right? Sometimes it still is. In some places it still is. Sometimes it's people who have a gender that's not male. We've lived in a patriarchal society for a long time, right? And women have not had a lot of rights for a long time, and in some cases, in some places, and in some ways, in some relationships, in some households, they're still put down and demeaned and thought of as a second-class citizen. Think about the LGBTQ community. Think about how many places are not safe for them. Think about how many houses of worship are not safe for them. Think about how many folks who would fall into that camp who want to seek a relationship with Jesus, who want to find a place that's safe to worship, and yet they cannot because of how much has been unsafe for them for so long. Think about those who are homeless. Think about those who haven't had a shower in a few weeks or in a few months. Think about those who haven't had a meal, who don't have any money, who've been staying in shelters, who have been sleeping on a park bench when it's warm enough. Think about those folks and whether or not they have a place to be. Think about those who have addiction problems, who can't seem to get themselves out of a drug or alcohol addiction or pornography or sex, or you name it, right? There's a million things out there to be addicted to. There are so many people that would fit into the categories of being marginalized today, right? These are the very people that Jesus went to. These are the people that he broke bread with, that he had communion with, right? These are the people who he said, look, it's not the healthy who are in need of a doctor, but it's the sick. I haven't come to call the righteous, but I've come to call the sinners. Jesus' harshest words were not for those who fell into sinful categories. And maybe it'd be helpful for me to go like this, sinful categories, right? Because there are times in the Bible, in the New Testament here, in the Gospels, where these authors are telling the story of Jesus, and they put sinners in quotations when they say Jesus ate with these sinners, right? Because there's these thoughts that the religious leaders had at the time as to who was sinners and who was not, who was clean and who was not, right? So we could look at our marginalized categories today, right? The people with different color skin, the people who are not male and live in a patriarchal society, the people who are struggling with homelessness or LGBTQ or you name it, whatever we would say is a marginalized group of people, those are the people that Jesus would have broken bread with. And so when we take the time to get to know people who are not like us, it changes our entire perspective. I read a study the other day that talks about the political divide in America, and it talks specifically about Republicans and Democrats. And when they polled both sides agreed that it would be better if the other side didn't exist, and not that it would be good if the other political party didn't exist. It'd be good if the individuals who believed in that political ideology didn't exist. What essentially they're saying is that it would be better if those people were gone. We're thinking then of them not as the image of God, but as something less than the image of God, simply because our political ideologies are different. It only takes us getting to know one person, statistically, one person who is in one of those categories that we have prejudged for our judgment to change, which means that if I am really judgmental toward the homeless, it takes me getting to know one homeless person for my perspective to change. If I'm really judgmental against the LGBTQ community, it takes me getting to know one person in the LGBTQ community for my perspective to change. If I'm really judgmental about what women can or can't do, it takes me getting to know one woman for my perspective to change. If I am struggling with racism, it takes me getting to know one person who is not the same color skin as me for my perspective to change. Statistically, one person. And so what we end up doing is we leave ourselves in these vacuums where we don't have a chance of meeting that one person that could change our perspective. And so in this political study, what was written about was the fact that we don't leave our camps. We create echo chambers so that we are only with our Republican friends, or we're only with our Democrat friends. And so then we never get to know somebody on another side of the aisle that lets us go, oh, you know what? There's real people with real hearts who really do care on both sides of this issue, right? When all we ever do is spend time in Christian community, we can be very judgmental about the scary non-Christians that are out there and the ways that they're going to take us down all the wrong paths. It takes us getting to know one person for our perspective to be changed. Now, am I saying that they don't need Jesus, that they're just great? No, I'm not saying that at all. Everybody needs Jesus. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. There is no way to the Father except through him. But the people who don't know him, who need him, are never going to hear about him if all you ever do is spend time with people from your church community. Now, think about these words from Jesus at the end of Matthew. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Now tell me, does that final command before Jesus ascends back to the Father, does that final command sound like somebody who is telling us to be really scared of people who aren't like us? Does that final command sound like someone who is telling us to make sure that we get into our churches, we become Christians, we lock the doors, and we don't interact with the world outside? Does that sound like somebody who's telling us to only have Christian friends and not to know anybody who is not a Christ follower? No, I don't think so. And I honestly think we do a huge injustice by not getting out there and finding ourselves in circles that are non-Christian. It's going to help you understand your faith better. And you're going to develop relationships that are going to change your perspective like that. Because suddenly you're going to get to know somebody that you thought before, I know all about that person. I know what they're like because of X, Y, and Z. The truth is, you don't. And I think that's part of what Jesus was showing us when he broke bread with the very people that the Pharisees, the rabbis who didn't leave the synagogue, judged and thought were too dirty and too beneath them to minister to. That ministry, the ministry of the synagogue, was done by you going to the synagogue. Suddenly we have a God who sends his Son to be the temple, and the temple comes to us. And now you get to be part of a people group whose call is to bless all of the nations of the world. You get to be part of a group whose leader, before he ascends to heaven, says, "Go into all nations, baptizing them, telling them about everything that I've taught you." You get to be one of the people who now take the temple to them. Jesus said, "My disciples are going to do greater things than even I did." And it's hard to believe that, but it's part of the legacy that you and I have been given. So, is it important for us to have community beyond the church? 100% yes. Is there a time in our maturity, whether that's in our youth or that's just in our Christian maturity, where we should probably be more concerned with surrounding ourselves with other Christ followers so that we may become strong in our faith and learn about who Jesus is and figure out what this thing is that we've committed to by following Jesus? Absolutely. But there comes a time when we got to throw the church doors open and we got to head out into the world and we got to make friends beyond the church. And I hope that you hear this with the heart that is intended. And I hope that you have a fantastic week.